And thank you. So just so everybody knows that this webinar is being recorded. And again, I would first want to just thank our co-sponsors in the room with NextGen Policy, and then invite Ken Spence to say a quick hello.
Good morning, everyone. Ken Spence, Senior Policy Advisor with NextGen, and really appreciate the chance to co-sponsor this webinar with our partner Calbright.
All right, thanks, Ken. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off by diving into a short presentation of the report findings, and then do full introductions of our panelists after the presentation. The presentation should take about 15 minutes or so, and it was research that was conducted in partnership with Lightcast in an efforts to find data demonstrating the true job skills and requirements for government sector jobs, particularly in California, and understand what key jobs are critical to the future of California's government sector. We wanted to identify opportunities specifically for adult learners and other individuals from under-resourced and historically underrepresented communities. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. So everybody should see the presentation here. When we're looking at the data, one of the things that we know, and I'm sure many of you are aware in this room, is historically that there's been so many limited opportunities in government sector jobs, particularly that among skilled workers who may not have a bachelor's degree. In a study that we found, approximately 70% of new jobs in the past decades were ones that were listed with a bachelor's degree requirement. When we narrow it down and look at California jobs, over 2.3 million jobs in California with state and local government agency. And if we're looking at 70% of those jobs with requirements, this translates into about 1.6 million Californians state jobs that are inaccessible to skilled workers, too many jobs. And when we look at what this, this particular number impacts, the people that they impact is really among the adult population, 63%, almost 64% of the adult population, and disproportionately we see here among Black adults and Hispanic adults, even higher than that, between 72 and 84% of adult population, Black or Hispanic, who may not have access to these jobs. So when we took a look and dove deeper into the data, we did find California's state and local public sector is the second biggest industry of employment within the state, making up over 9% of total employment. And this does include district, municipal, and county, as well as state level jobs. There's a strong presence in all regions. And so we see that this is a really great opportunity for us to look at and see and really address in a meaningful way. The demand we also have looked at and noticed that the demand outpaces the supply, meaning there are more jobs than there are individuals who can address and be filled and fill these labor shortages across the state public sector. And we also, when we looked into the data more closer by region, greater Los Angeles area, Bay Area, and other rural areas had high demand by volume of jobs. We also found that across all of these jobs, there are many different opportunities across many experience levels and career background levels. So in this particular report, we did kind of dive in more specifically to the entry and mid-level occupation and look at the occupations across various industries, including healthcare, administrative, IT, and education roles. So what does this actually look like across regions? In the report and in the data that we dove into for the past years, we found again, the percentage of California public sector postings does vary anywhere between about 7-8% up to about 24% by region. And when we look at how much of that it makes up of the California sector employment, it again varies between 8 and 29%. We also noticed that, of course, greater Los Angeles area where there are more individuals and more population living in that area, it is a little bit higher in these areas, but San Joaquin and capital regions also, trending pretty high here. When we look at the public sector jobs and online jobs, we see that the intensity for almost all jobs really, are quite high here. The number of job postings from the various job occupation roles, we could see in the last 12 months from secretarial and administrative assistants to medical assistants, registered nursing, and more, just across the industries and sectors. We also see a number of IT and computer occupation listed here. In the industry itself, and I realize that the text on the screen may be a little bit small, but we do see growth occurring across multiple industries. So on the left-hand side here, from information technology to environmental frontline supervisors, to correctional operation and research, and then education, teachers, instructors here. So we could see over the past number of years, the trend of job openings just and the demand grow. When it comes to underutilized workers, we notice that there are a number of underutilized workers in California, underutilized, including those who are unemployed, underemployed, and marginally attached. And what's interesting to note here is that of the underutilized workers, about half of those individuals are underemployed or marginally attached. And this marginally attached population, these are individuals who have removed themselves from the job market, but who would come back, or they are currently not actively searching for a job, but would accept one if offered. So really a particular demographic of interest for us. And when we look at the underutilization rates across regions, we know and we are able to see that San Joaquin and Greater Los Angeles have greater underutilization rates across the state. But you can also see here rural communities as well as capital and Bay Area kind of inching up. And this just highlights for us again, by region, where there are a large number of not only the unemployed, but underemployed and marginally attached population. And of course, when we think about and look at the disproportionate impact here, again, the underutilization by race ethnicity, on the right-hand side, where we see that tall peak, that's over 30%, that is American Indian or Alaskan Native individuals. But we see here too, kind of in this mid-range, Hispanic and Black African American have underutilization rates that exceeds those of Asian and their white counterparts, the two bars on the left-hand side. So as we're thinking about occupations and government sector opportunities, how might we be able to address and think about ways to really engage these underutilized individuals and potentially transition them into a career opportunity? When it comes down to the skills, one of the things that we found that, we really want to think of how we can right size jobs and shift to a skills-based hiring approach. In the analysis that was conducted, we found that when we looked at the applicant pool, with the less than typical education requirements, so those without potentially a bachelor's degree, that they possessed about 50% of skills. They had skills that overlapped with about the jobs, the skills that were required for the jobs, up to about 30% of those that industry demanded. So we know that these individuals, while they may not possess the degree, have these skills that could be very critical into responding to the demand and be able to supply that. And how might we be able to think about ways to continue to close the gap, the skills gap, and transition those individuals looking at some of these occupational areas so that they can gain entry into the system. And in order for us to do this, several challenges, we do want to be able to address. First off, of course, the need for a future-ready workforce. We know that just sectors across multiple industries, multiple sectors are all facing talent shortages. For the public sector, this means too that we are competing against a lot of the private entities and a lot of other areas, including out of state. For the supply gap, how do we ensure that the supply stress is responded to and ensuring that local individuals and individuals within regions have the opportunity in order to address some of the supply gap and gain entry into those jobs. We also know that in the public sector, of course, the hiring process can be quite lengthy and cumbersome. A lot of different hurdles may exist that does not necessarily exist in other sectors. So how might we be able to address that? And then also again about this underutilization rate. When we looked at the data across multiple states, California has one of the highest underutilization rates, particularly among people of color. So how can we ensure equity and engage with those underutilized workers here? And of course, skills-based hiring is an approach that I know many of you have heard about, have been able to engage in, or even consider. Of course, some of the benefits of skills-based hiring allows a more diverse workforce by opening up these opportunities and not looking at what have typically been used as some proxies, such as the degree requirement. And we know that there are a number of different private entities that have already moved towards skills-based hiring, including some of these that are shown on screen here. And we know that there are a number of states growing that are now revisiting the degree requirement, at least 21 states with either some form of legislation, executive order, or some policy that have shifted towards eliminating the degree requirement. For us, the good news is, we have momentum on our side. Governor's executive order to prepare the workforce has allowed us to begin to reduce some of these barriers for employment. This includes expanding access and training programs, including student support services, strengthening the partnership between education and employers. And then, also mandating to think about how we improve our data collection and analysis in order to provide services for students and workers in the state of California. Of course, for us, from the Calbright side, we are continuing to just address through programmatic design and thinking about how we can best align our programs to labor market needs. When we looked at the specific jobs, what we found were a number of occupations that were kind of prime and ready for us to think about how we might be able to design program in order to offer skills that could help these individuals gain entry into these important public sector jobs. And you can see some of these listed on screen here. So with that, the report will be released and this deck will be available for folks to take a look at and dig in more deeply and more thoroughly. What I wanted to do now was I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share here. I would love to bring Ken back into the room in order to introduce our panelists for a panel discussion. For the audience in the room, we do recommend that you go to the top of your Zoom screen and select speaker view for the best viewing experience. And just so you know, after the panel discussion, we will open up for Q&A. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please feel free to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom webinar. Ken?
Thanks, Ben. That was an excellent overview of the report. And I can say for myself, it really provoked a lot of thoughts. I thought there was a lot of good insights there, which makes me excited for this panel of experts that we have coming up. So I'm going to do a brief introduction for everyone and give them a chance to say a little bit more about themselves if they like, and then we'll move on to the questions. Our first panelist is the president and CEO of Calbright College, Ajita Talwalker Menon. Her job is to lead the college to help underserved Californians gain greater economic mobility and to provide skilled talent for hiring employers. Ms. Menon has dedicated her career to supporting government agencies, higher education institutions and systems, and nonprofit organizations to drive better and more equitable outcomes in higher education and workforce training. Ajita, anything you'd like to add?
No, thank you, Ken.
You're welcome. Our next panelist is Adele Burns, who's the Deputy Chief for the Division of Apprenticeship Standards. Adele has spent her career in workforce development and economic empowerment. She has worked at this important issue from many different angles, including government policy work, tech startups, to development startups, leading strategy and operations for a nonprofit, Europe Bay Area, and as the first ever regional director of apprenticeships for the Bay Area Community College Consortium. And Adele, anything you'd like to add?
No, thanks for including me in the conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Likewise, likewise. Our next panelist is Abby Snay, who's the Deputy Secretary of Workforce Strategy for the California Labor and Workforce Development Agency. Abby is Deputy Secretary, as I said, and she has worked to increase economic mobility for immigrants and refugees, to create a new healthcare workforce initiative in partnership with the California Health and Human Services Agency, to expand apprenticeships into California, and to develop training and workforce opportunities through the state's climate strategies. Abby, anything you'd like to add?
No, that's great. I'm also so excited about being here. Thanks.
You're welcome. And finally, we have my boss, Arnie Sowell Jr., who's the Executive Director for NextGen Policy. NextGen is a nonprofit organization that works to advance progressive policy solutions across a range of areas, including climate change, affordable housing, healthcare, education, criminal justice, mental health, and more. Arnie leads the NGP team and manages their legislative, political, advocacy, and programmatic activities. Arnie, anything you'd like to add?
No, thank you for that introduction, Ken, and likewise, I'm very, very pleased to be here today.
Okay, great. Well, let's dive into the questions. My first question is for Ajita. So Ajita, can you tell us, why did Calbright feel that this was an important body of research to conduct at this time? What were you hearing from students or public agency partners that kind of led you to pursue this research?
Thanks, Ken, for the question. And I did just want to echo my thanks to everyone for being here today, because I think today's discussion is really an important marker for confronting the challenges that many of us have really understood to be looming on the horizon, both for the public sector workforce, but also for those in our communities who have found themselves increasingly sidelined by economic challenges. So I'm very grateful to be around the virtual table to discuss new solutions in the actual world around us. I think we know that for some time, as a state and as a nation, we've been really experiencing large gaps in our understanding of how underserved communities are actually experiencing the labor market. So for us and many others, we're seeking to better understand labor market realities, but from the lens of the job seeker, as well as employers in the public sector, because we know, especially in California, the public sector is really an anchor of the job market in many regions, and especially in many local communities up and down the state. So for us at Calbright, we see the report is really crucial to have a foundation to help us surface new solutions that are really anchored in being responsive to the needs of both employers and job seekers, for serving, in particular, our diverse student body of nearly 4,500 students at Calbright, but maybe even more importantly, to contribute to supporting all of our public higher education institutions in California. So especially, I wanted to highlight the really important role that California community colleges have to play, and helping all of us to better understand how to align higher ed offerings with the public sector labor market needs, and also to focus in on really creating new opportunities to further the outcomes for working age adults. This is also for us in service of Chancellor Christian's remarkable Vision 2030, which focuses on breaking down barriers to education access and specifically upskilling for adult learners. So, for Calbright, since we've launched just a few years ago, we've continued to be very laser focused on analyzing the labor market so we can prepare our students and have the benefit of sharing our learnings across the system for success beyond the classroom. So, in large part, our offerings are based on a real in-depth understanding of the actual skills that are needed across industries in the context of the knowledge economy that we find ourselves in. But not just for the skills that are needed today, we're also needing to prepare students for what they can expect down the road, 5 years, 10 years from now. So that when folks enter the workforce from a new vantage point and a new opportunity, a new foothold, they can thrive amidst what we know is just going to be a continually evolving labor market. One of the things we know is that 42% of our students are unemployed. They've indicated to us that they're unemployed. And so for many of us, this is not a shock because we're looking at the data and we're seeing that California is currently leading the nation with the highest unemployment rate, but it's such a deeply felt economic shock for our students who find themselves really pretty bravely reaching out for this opportunity that they need, one that can fit in their lives and the challenges that they're experiencing, and one that holds promise for not just a job, but a career future. So we're very kind of clear-eyed about what students have told us they need, why they're coming to us. And we know that it's more than just offering students a flexible and accessible education. It has to be about that collaboration across higher education, industries, and employers, of course, but also nonprofits and philanthropies, because it is all about working together to advance skills-based hiring as a lever for increasing equity across California's workforce. So we see California as playing a really critical role for the nation, and we see more states seeking to reduce barriers to employment that kind of unlock this talent in their communities. But we don't have a comprehensive playbook just yet. And so I think this research is really in service also of advancing the goals of Governor Newsom's 2023 executive order about preparing the workforce of tomorrow, and kind of focusing in exclusively on, or particularly on, skills-based hiring, and focusing that lens on the public sector. So we thought it was really necessary to highlight the critical role that California's public sector plays in the advancement of that agenda around skills-based hiring, especially because it dovetails so critically with the need in states and local and regional economies. So when crafting this research, I think we've really sought to create opportunities for working age adults across all backgrounds to really have access to good, stable, longstanding employment opportunities.
Thank you, Ajita. I'll pass over to Ben for the next question.
Yeah, thank you. So Ajita, I know, you mentioned in your response here the collaboration, of course, and in our report, we found that while the share of public sector jobs in California makes up the second largest industry, we are also within this industry experiencing major hiring challenges. And so maybe this question, I don't know, Ajita, if you could expand, and I would love to invite Adele to answer on this one as well. But how can public sector employers and educators collaborate in order to better understand and prepare for this evolving trend and meet the future skills needs within the industry?
think it's a great question, and I look forward to actually hearing Adele's response on this, as well as Abby and Arnie's. The one thing I'll start out by saying is I think we've often looked at this problem or question of alignment from the perspective of, educators are not doing enough to align to labor market needs. And the labor market folks on the demand side of the economy always saying somehow folks are leaving our higher education institutions without the job-ready skills they need to be successful in the workplace. And so we've talked about that as a two-way disconnect. But when we look under the hood a little bit more closely, what we see is each side of the marketplace has some work to do. And on the higher education side of this equation, it is absolutely about collaborating around identifying the right skills and aligning to the needs that are present in industry, but also trying to see around the bend a little bit for the types of durable skills that allow folks to navigate additional skilling that they'll need throughout their career. And we need to make that easier in higher education with new models and new opportunities for folks to have experiences and learning opportunities that better fit for the life realities that they're navigating. So that's the work, some of the work we have to do on the higher education side. On the demand side of the marketplace, it's fairly opaque in many cases, especially in the private sector of the marketplace, as to what really conditions hiring. What do we need to understand about what the barriers to hiring actually look like? And what do we as educators and educational institutions need to understand about that? How can we contribute support to what needs to be addressed to make the marketplace on the demand side work more functionally, to better connect the needs of employers with job seekers. And so in that regard, I think we see things like degree requirements increasingly over the past couple of decades creep up to higher and higher levels, and to be increasingly disconnected from the conversation around skills. So rather than what does the degree proxy mean in terms of your likelihood to be able to perform a job, rather, how can you demonstrate the skills that you have and show their alignment to, what the employer actually needs. And there's no better place, I think, to do this than the public sector, because while it's sometimes idiosyncratic and challenging, it is also transparent and predictable. And so, the way that we can continue to lean in and experiment very openly about surfacing new solutions and new ways that address both of the gaps that we're seeing on either side of the marketplace, I think is a great start to that.
Thank you, Ajita. Adele?
Yeah, I want to appreciate that both of the focus that Calbright has on really like staying focused in your educational goals on the labor market demands. So I just want to appreciate that as one of the core lenses that you bring. And then, of course, selfishly, as a member of the public sector, I appreciate this particular report, because one of the things that I know is shared in this report, and is something that I experience in our division, but also we look at, is how public sector employment has not recovered to where it was pre-pandemic, and basically every other sector of our economy has, or is exceeding pre-pandemic levels. And so I just appreciate this report and this focus on this subject, and completely agree with all those things that you just laid out. And I would offer one mechanism that I know is mentioned in the report and is really my world, is how could we be using the mechanism of apprenticeship as one of the solutions in the toolbox that we use to try to solve this talent crisis, and including in the public sector. So my role at the Division of Apprenticeship Standards is to look at how are we taking this mechanism of apprenticeship, which is very well utilized and a mature mechanism on the building and fire trades sectors, and how can we use this mechanism in all the other parts of our economy, including in the public sector. So apprenticeship, sort of the core pillars of what an apprenticeship is that it is typically an entry-level job. It's a job that recognizes that somebody is learning on the job, and that on-the-job time is scaffolded with education that's specifically designed to be upskilling somebody for that job. So somebody is working and earning, and they're also learning in classroom instruction that's been curated to help them upskill in that job. So the really core thing here is the earning part. So an apprenticeship, sometimes people will say like an internship or an apprenticeship or other work-based learning. And it's a spectrum and there's value to all of them. But the thing I would really call out there is that an apprenticeship is a job. Somebody is working and earning. And that is so important because there's a lot of folks who can't afford not to be earning, whether they are 18, 19, 20 and can't afford to not be earning. And they certainly can't afford to be going into debt for college in many cases. But I also see that there are folks who are midpoint or later point in their career and need to reskill and don't have the option to not be earning while they reskill. And so I really see apprenticeship as a key employment and workforce development mechanism that creates that earn and learn on-ramp into a career. And I will say when we look at the utilization of apprenticeship in the public sector, interestingly, there's some very well-established corners of public sector employment that have used apprenticeship for a long time. For example, the California Joint, it's called CalJAC, it's the Joint Apprenticeship Committee, but it's the Cal Fire. It's the firefighter industry, which of course, public sector employment, it's the single largest apprenticeship program in the country. There's 10,000 apprentices across different occupations in EMT and paramedic and firefighters. And so that's a vast system of apprenticeship that is public sector apprenticeship. Another example is in our correctional facility, the peace officers there, they are, we call it C-Post is that program. That's another huge program. So there's certain corners of our public sector that are really utilizing this mechanism of apprenticeship to create this earn and learn on-ramp into certain occupations. And what we're trying to do is to really expand that. And we're seeing it happen. And I see a lot of overlap in the occupations that you all highlight in your report and areas that we are already piloting and growing apprenticeships in. One example is CalHR and SCIU are partnering on an incumbent worker upskilling apprenticeship program across a few different occupations. Some interesting ones, there's like a custodian to office technician apprenticeship program. So that's upskilling folks into office technician roles, which I know we saw some of those like administrative roles in your list of needed employment. Another one that's also has an overlap with this report is the cybersecurity analyst role is another one that particular program offers. Another area that's emerging, there's a group called the Institute for Local Governments, which is looking to become a public sector apprenticeship intermediary, which basically tries to help with a lot of that municipal, local, county government employment and to be designing an apprenticeship program in accounting or in mental health, like these kind of job areas. And I think they're doing a very similar analysis to what's summarized in this report in terms of what are the occupations where there's a lot of vacancy and a lot of need to be training and upskilling folks, and how could we be using this mechanism of apprenticeship there. Community health workers is another big area that's, there's a lot of efforts across the state to create apprenticeships around that. And then finally, this one wasn't in your report, but I wanted to call it out, is transportation. So there's a lot of transportation apprenticeships like the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, the Orange County Transportation Authority, San Diego Trolley. All of these are examples of existing apprenticeship programs. And some of these have been around for a little while and are growing. Some of these are very, very nascent efforts, but that's just to give you a few examples of where apprenticeships are starting to be utilized across different areas. And we're really hopeful for how this can increasingly be one of the tools in the toolbox for improving representation, creating these earn and learn on-ramps into careers, and really sort of opening up the funnel of talent that we're inviting into public sector employment.
Thank you for that, Adele. I think so important that you call out and shared, all of these examples of apprenticeships, and definitely, the thing that you are saying that really resonate with me is the idea of like, this is one tool in the toolbox, because there's going to have to definitely be multiple mechanisms in order for this to work. And the earn and learn, so the apprenticeship offering income for those individuals. To your point, people cannot often afford to just stop earning. So from the equity standpoint, just so important that that mechanism is in place and continues to grow and is expanded on. So thank you for sharing that. Ken, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Ben. So the report highlights, and I think a couple of our panelists have also stressed, this issue is challenge of talent shortages, right? And I can say there seems to have been a lot of conversations around skills-based hiring. However, what we hear as far as leading practices doesn't always translate well when it comes to the implementation, right? So this question is for all the panelists, anyone who would like to answer it, but how do we go about building confidence in and demonstrating the validity of the skills and alternate qualifications that students and job seekers have through an equitable hiring process, one that's streamlined and easy to navigate? And
I could jump in if you want.
Yeah,
and first of all, thanks again for the opportunity to be part of this really important discussion. I really appreciate Calbright's commissioning of the report, and also throughout the report and this discussion today, the emphasis on the demand side of the equation as well as the supply side, which I think is what this question leads to. And I think, as you're suggesting, Ken, the adoption of skills-based, or I think increasingly being referred to as skills-first hiring, is, wonderful in concept, and it's slow in adoption. There was a Harvard blog a couple of months ago that spoke to this. And when we think of what we might be able to do to make this shift more of a reality for employers, I've been thinking about 4 different steps. The first being awareness, really increasing awareness, and Opportunity at Work, which is a national organization, really led by some veterans of the Obama White House, have really been leaders in this space. I think most of us, certainly in urban areas, have seen the ubiquity of ads in transit, and the very smart partnership that Opportunity at Work did with the Ad Council, I think, has just gotten the tear down the paper ceiling, transit ads, billboards kind of embedded in our awareness, which is great. We also need ambassadors, right? We need companies and organizations who have had success, and your slide showed a few of them, to be ambassadors with their peers externally, and then internally within their organizations, which I think leads to a third step, which is almost vertical penetration of the practices. Sometimes, changes in hiring practices, sound great, and we could get buy-in at the C-level, but that has to seep all the way through an organization into HR practices and into the actual hiring managers. And that takes time, and that takes culture change and practice change. And I think the fourth thing that I've been thinking about is change in technology systems. I mean, most hiring, the first phases are done by, these, screening technologies which rely on artificial intelligence. So there has to be some relearning of AI to screen those applications and resumes differently and pull out different kinds of keywords. So I think, this is a great concept. It has some early adopters, but, those are a few things we could do for greater adoption.
No, excellent points, Abby. Excellent points. Especially around the app ambassador idea and the need to kind of employ AI, things I've been thinking about as well. Anything anyone else would like to add or maybe react to some of what Abby surfaced?
I would just add that I echo I love the framing on it, and also the clear identification, or these are sort of tactical collaborations and partnerships that get us to further the goal, right? This is not just a set of policies, not just a set of practices, but a little bit more of a movement, right? The shifting that has to happen within an organization, but first almost at the mindset level, then the skill set level, is best accomplished when we're in the field doing that work together. And I just sort of would say that for us, we sort of opened the door. We've been having conversations with a number of counties up and down the state who are identifying the gap and the shortages and the skills need. And that was some of the feedback that also led us to think about the report in this way and how it could be leveraged and utilized to actually design what do those partnerships look like? What is that piloting and experimentation with an eye towards how these practices embed within an organization and scale across other organizations that are struggling with similar challenges. So we have an open door for folks who are interested in exploring this with us, especially in areas where we're naturally programmatic aligned. And also, you know, I think as we get the report further out there, one of the goals we have is to be able to surface it for other folks who can participate and contribute, right? So we're not a silver bullet solution here in any kind of way. It's so important that we can get this report into the hands of folks who have the opportunity to take action on either side of the equation. And so we look forward to continuing conversations like this in that way.
Thank you, Ajita. Thank you, Ajita. Go ahead, Arnie. Do you want to jump in?
And I was going to add, I too, this is a very rich conversation. I just appreciate all the comments that my fellow panelists have made already. And I think one of the things that Abby just said just sort of struck me, because we were talking about skills-based and identifying sort of skills-based hiring, et cetera. And she used the phrase, it's also referred to as skills first. And what that made me think of is the fact that we also need employers to also be first movers in the sense of attempting to take on new ways of going about hiring, new pathways, new processes, et cetera. And so I just wanted to just sort of to add that as there are, as Adele pointed out, several different entities that are out there within government and the like that have gone down the apprenticeship pathway, have gone down other pathways, and we just need additional folks within the systems to begin to understand what those models can lead to, the efficacy of those models, to trust some of those models, and also to bring to the table potentially other things that might also be tried and true or lend themselves to success. And so I just wanted to offer that in terms of we need some additional first movers.
Thanks, Arnie. And we have an audience question that I think might fit well here. So the question was, if credentials aren't an adequate proxy for skills, what are some ways that skills can be communicated to employers? And what would be the role of colleges and universities in that effort? And whoever would like to take that on.
You know, I could jump in a little bit unless you were going to, Ajita. Right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know there's a lot of buzz and something that we'll get to later in this conversation about the work that was the other part of the Executive Order 23 you've been referring to, which really calls for a new master plan for career education in the state. And building out some of the work that the Career Ed Council has already been done in creating both an e-transcript and a career passport. And some of the vision around the career passport is that that could be the tool to identify skills that are achieved in education and ideally in the workplace, because part of this constellation of tasks includes credit for prior learning, which we would like to see for apprenticeship, for military duty, for other work-based learning and just plain old work experience in a way that then can be part of a career passport that can show employers the skills that are actually achieved and mastered. What we need, though, and this is, something that a lot of us are talking about, is a shared language, a shared taxonomy, a shared structure of skills that is commonly used, that isn't overwhelming, isn't manageable, is manageable, that is, our way of translating what students and workers have to employer needs. So I think this is very much on the radar screen, not yet fixed, but and calls for changes both in the education system and in private and public sector hiring. So we're talking about some really big changes.
Definitely. Ajita?
Yes, I agree with all that. I also was going to mention credit for prior learning and the sort of translation role that's required of higher education leaders, and understanding how what we are awarding or validating or transcripting as learning actually translates, the message and the signal is received on the hiring side of the marketplace. And I do think there's some great efforts in the field that are trying to connect the dots in this way. So most recently, the Competency-Based Education Network, SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, and one other entity, I'm sorry, is escaping me right now. It have come together to kind of ask this question around standardization, right? How do we actually identify and then also have a framework and a rubric for validating skills? And that's kind of at the heart of what we're trying to do in practice, aligned with those standard bearers. So, we've seen this happen where if you lack a standardization on the unit of what measures the skill appropriately, and you don't have buy-in from both the employer side and the educational side, you're speaking two different languages. And the opportunity for us to have really disciplined rubrics for assessing skills as educational institutions, and to make sure those rubrics and standards are validated on the employment side of the marketplace, is the thing that can unlock the translation between the higher education institutions and the hiring side of things. And that can also feed into more reliable products and services that are used in the hiring processes. And the one thing I will say there is that what feels most important is to audition this, right? So I think once we have those kinds of things, it's so critically important to have partners on the education side and on the employer side to really test out these kinds of things. And so public sector presents a tremendous opportunity and an area for us to do that in very tangible and concrete ways. The other, the last addition I'll say to this is that also what is clear is that a singular credential or a one moment in time of learning is not going to be sufficient over the course of the career. And so what we also need is the ability for higher education to not just translate, but to give greater permission for learning to count towards accelerated credentials. And that's going to be a big transformation on the higher ed side of the marketplaces. So in some ways, community colleges can get really good, probably more quickly than other parts of the higher ed sector, at communicating back and forth across employers, and they have more practice at being, working to be responsive to what is needed in the marketplace. But we also need that currency, not just to move across the market, but also to move vertically upward within the educational marketplace. And we are also looking forward to partnering with four-year institutions in that regard. And so the shorthand I always say is, what we do on competency-based education and the validation of skills that translates to the labor market, we're also seeking partners and to pilot the work of how students can then carry the football the farthest. I'm from the Midwest, so still use football analogies, into the four-year educational market, because the degree proxy, while we seek to change it and we seek to disaggregate it to look at the skills that are actually needed for employers to see workplace success amongst their employees and those they hire, we're not in that universe yet. And as the steps that we're going to need to take to get there might involve for many folks really getting to that point where they can access a four-year degree, how can we make that real and possible for them also down the road?
No, excellent, excellent. I think that's a good place for me to transition to the next question. I'll pass it back over to Ben.
All right, thank you. So this next question is really centered around equity and creating opportunities for underutilized workers. And Adele, I would love to hear from you on this question, and then perhaps others from the panel as well. But we saw that in the report, there are truly, just so many underutilized workers in California, the highest amongst all the states. What strategies do you feel can be implemented to better utilize this large pool of underutilized workers, particularly those among community of colors? And then what are we seeing in perhaps like other sectors that can be leveraged? Like, what do we know works? And I'm going to add on, if I may, just one more piece, because this is an important question from the audience, I think. The incentivization for underutilized workers. We know that often public sector salaries, particularly in California, might not be able to compete, against some of these tech giants. What do we do? How do we address that?
Lots in there. Okay. So I would say, and again, I so appreciate this full arc of the conversation around thinking about skills-based or skills-first hiring. And of course, my brain, my work always comes back to this mechanism of apprenticeship. I really do see this as a key mechanism to be supporting those underutilized workers in getting a bridge back in, right? And so some of those examples that I gave earlier of different public sector apprenticeship programs are certainly examples of that. I will also mention some work that we've been doing recently, really looking at opportunity youth, which are those folks who are 16 to 24, who are either disconnected from our education system, probably fall into that underutilized workers category, right? Or are at high risk of disconnection from our education system. And how are we making sure that as we're expanding apprenticeship opportunities across a lot of different sectors, of course, including the public sector, how are we making sure that we're thinking about this population and making sure that we're building supported on-ramps for those folks into these different apprenticeship opportunities? Because while I'm very excited about apprenticeship as an earn and learn, it is a job that you have to get, right? And so sometimes just even getting your foot in the door for an apprenticeship can have its own challenges. And so we we're in the process of awarding the first round of what's called the California Opportunity Youth Apprenticeship Grant, the COYA grant, which is really specifically looking at how do we create these on-ramps into apprenticeship for opportunity youth. And so the funding is going towards both the planning and the implementation of both pre-apprenticeship programs, which are helping to train folks to be prepared for an apprenticeship, and also really well-supported apprenticeship programs, specifically thinking about opportunity youth. And one of the key areas that we did a whole public comment process around the development of this grant, and we have a California Youth Apprenticeship Committee that's been advising us on kind of how we create a whole system of youth apprenticeship in California. And one of the really key things that we heard is that supportive services are so critical, and like flexibility around supportive services, because one person might need legal support to sort through immigration issues or sort through domestic issues or whatever's going on, where another person might really need transportation support because getting to the program or showing up at work is not so simple, or others might need childcare supports. And so really thinking about like a halo of supportive services. And I will say there's a lot of different ways that apprenticeship programs come together. And sometimes those supportive services are going to be provided through like a nonprofit organization that's really good at providing those supportive services. And that nonprofit might partner with an apprenticeship program. And this COYA grant could be a mechanism to fund those supportive services, for example. But also unions are often in the mix in an apprenticeship program, and often unions can be playing that role of providing those supportive services. Just another example of public sector apprenticeships, which is doing some of these like really well supported pathways, is our California Correctional Healthcare Services is working with SEIU to do a licensed vocational nurse to registered nurse apprenticeship program. And they're working with a few different community colleges, which are delivering the education. These LVNs get experience both on the job in order to upskill from being an LVN to an RN. And what's incredible about this program, like they do it in cohorts so that there's some community created among the apprentices. But 80 to 90% of these cohorts are women and people of color. And they experience almost a 100% increase in compensation from the beginning of the apprenticeship. Going from an LVN to a registered nurse is a big compensation jump. Like that's the kind of jump that really creates family sustaining wages. And so that's one example of public sector employment. Again, that one's been around for a few years, so they've really got their model together. They've got their educational partners together. But we're really excited about like, how can we take this equation again and apply it in a lot of different areas? And I think that's a great example of really of a well-supported program that's really thinking about these, in healthcare, there's a lot of occupational segregation where there's a lot of diversity if you look at the whole healthcare industry, but then if you zoom in by the occupations, you see like, well, actually in the higher earning areas, there's a lot less representation than in the lower earning areas. So this is one example of how apprenticeship is being used to help upskill and really address that occupational segregation. So those are a few mechanisms. And then the one other area that I want to be sure to comment on, and this is a much more nascent area, but I know you mentioned educators in your report as another key area, and a big area that we're working on. Actually, Abby and I are collaborating quite a lot on this, is a whole teacher apprenticeship working group. And we're looking at how can we be creating this earn and learn pathway to becoming a credentialed teacher. And there's a huge shortage of teachers in California right now. And so we're working across a really incredible set of folks that includes folks in the Department of Education, includes the California Teachers Association. There's a vast array of folks at this table working on how can we set up teacher apprenticeships, because again, we want to make sure that the teachers in our classrooms look like the students that they're serving. And the ways that we prepare teachers these days asks them to not earn while they're in training, which is just, as we've talked about, there's a lot of people who can't afford to do that. And so it's leading to a lack of representation and a lack of that supported earn and learn on-ramp into being a teacher. So that's a more nascent area, but it's one that I wanted to be sure to call out in this conversation, because I think that's another really key area of public sector employment that we're looking at.
Thank you, Adele. I know you said so many important nuggets here, including, again, I just love the framing around the halo of supportive services, ensuring that, it's not just the education and the employers. It's really thinking about all of these other services, including the unions, nonprofit, other agencies, and working together. And then the other thing is this idea of the on-ramp, which, Ajita, I don't know if you want to say more, because you spoke about this a little bit, about thinking about, here at Calbright, we offer our programs knowing and believing that this is a step of transition in, and how can we ensure from an equity standpoint that this first step is only the first step of many steps we foresee. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
Yeah, I will just say, I think that's what we've learned about supportive services. We've often thought about support services traditionally in higher ed as connecting folks to an external resource or having a program here or a program there, but not really understanding how we scaffold an entire end-to-end experience for a learner in a way that's more seamless. And so, that is one of the things that I think I'm most proudest of what we've been accomplishing as an institution, as reflected by our learners. So the thing that our learners tell us is that what made this possible for them was not actually the fact that it was free or affordable, but it was actually the fact that it was flexible, and they felt specifically the support staff and the community that they were building at Calbright was an essential condition of their success. And I say that because what we find in terms of where the disconnect sometimes is we don't learn our learner well enough on the support side, or our beneficiary well enough to really understand from their perspective, how do we unlock the supports in a way that actually means they'll benefit from it, they'll connect to it, and also they will be able to create the space in their lives to actually create the conditions in which they can pursue their education. And so the support thing is directly, I think, in built into the design from an end-to-end perspective, not through separate programs, but through an understanding that folks need a lot of this stuff more streamlined. And I think we're excited to continue down this road as the system itself is kind of looking more closely at how do we connect folks with available resources that they're eligible for. So there are opportunities for folks, especially who are lower income and are eligible to take advantage of supports, but often are those supports are not yet accessible to them in the ways that they need to be. So what can the role of the educational institution be to provide more connection to that support, especially place-based supports in our case, but also in the case of learners in traditional institutions as well. So I think there's such a critical part of building that relationship and connection with the folks that we're trying to support through this process, and really understanding the needs from their perspective in the way that we design how to best support them.
Thank you, Ajita. Ken?
Thanks, Ben. So the next question is for Abby and Arnie. So thinking about like the current landscape, right? We've heard kind of throughout the conversation today, the issues and challenges the public sector is facing is going to take a variety of players kind of working together to kind of and using a variety of approaches. What have you seen observed as some of the biggest barriers to kind of organizing and moving forward these types of collaborations? And either Abby or Arnie can take this on first.
Sure. This may be stating the obvious, especially in the current budget climate, but resources are always a challenge. The kinds of deep partnerships we've been talking about, the kinds of support services, the capacity it takes to refer people, to identify needs and refer people to support services really takes resources. And that's, of course, challenging right now. And we've been talking so much about the connections to employers, making sure that we're designing and delivering training that responds to employers' needs, that we're working with employers on these new tools and approaches for hiring. And those really take more customized approaches, and that takes resources. I think there's a lot of clustering we can do around sectors. And one of the reasons I've been so excited about the report and this discussion is that within the world of workforce, I've thought for a long time that public sector has kind of been undervalued as an approach for sector-based employment and training. Other challenges, a couple of things that I've also been thinking about are how state level systems don't always create incentives for collaboration, and sometimes the reward system has to do with competition. So I think there's some system-wide work we want to do to incentivize collaboration. A specific policy issue I've been thinking about is, I don't know how much all of you in the audience is familiar with the employment training panel. It is a really, highly effective resource to employers for incumbent and new hire training that, by the nature of the funding structure and the legislation that set this up, is not available to public sector employers. Could we be imaginative in policy changes and legislative changes, in a parallel system that could really create more opportunities and more resources for public sector employers to invest in their workforce? And then something that has come up a little bit in this conversation, but I wanted to pull out, is the public sector is about the last remaining sector in the US workforce that is heavily unionized. And which is really great. And it's probably the main reason that we're talking about public sector employment and how public sector jobs can be family sustaining jobs, jobs that offer access for people without fancy degrees, although we want to do that better, and opportunities for career advancement. What this means, though, is that when we're designing programs in the public sector, we have another customer to work with, and and a really key customer. And I think if we want to be smart about successfully designing workforce and education programs and working closely with employers, we really need to pull in our labor partners as well, for the design of programs and for getting the worker voice, to help us understand at a very deep level what works. And we've been part of conversations, I spent all day yesterday in a really amazing conference in San Francisco on the impact of AI in the workforce. And if we really want to understand how AI could make jobs better and reduce redundancy and not be a force for elimination, we need to start with the workers and their representatives. So I think working with unions in this sector just creates a unique and important opportunity.
I just want to echo that, Abby. I think it's so critically important, particularly because organized workers are such an important part of understanding truly how we assess what needs are. And I think increasingly you see unions like SEIU really aware and attuned to what their members are experiencing and also what their members are needing. And we need to be at the table listening and being educated by that perspective. And that deeply appreciate the point, and that's something that we also, it's a core value of ours as well.
Arnie, anything you'd like to add?
Ken, there are various things that I was thinking that I was going to add, and I kept looking at my notes and my fellow panelists. I keep checking off things that I was going to say, and they've already said. And so, but here are a couple of things that I think I would like to offer at this particular point in time. One of the things that struck me is numbers when I look at this report, and it's just the total amount of jobs as well as the total of amount of sort of job opportunities that are out there. And in some respects, if you really think about it, the total number of public sector jobs that are out there in the state of California are probably more than the populations of some states in our nation. And to me, that says that one size cannot fit all, and we cannot do the same sorts of rote hiring practices, the same sorts of just the same way of doing business that we've been doing business, and many of the fellow panelists have talked about that. I just also just sort of offer that even when, as Abby just mentioned, even when we are in a state budget crunch, as we are.
Did we lose him? The file is frozen.
Yeah, it looks like it might have frozen on me. It's okay.
Maybe we come back to Arnie when he's able to rejoin. Okay, yeah, with that.
Oh, he was just on a
I
roll
know.
too.
I dropped the wisdom. But Ben, you want to ask the next question and we can circle back to Arnie?
Sure. Let's go ahead and do that. Abby, this question, and you did start to touch on this a little bit, but I wanted to, perhaps invite you to expand a little bit more, with Governor Newsom's executive order on skills-based hiring. I know, there's been a huge movement to reduce these barriers, and of course, the master plan for career education, which you touched on earlier, is really designed to help us, be able to address this and implement on it. So how do we take this moment and this momentum now and lean in and continue to ensure that more individuals are qualified for public sector positions without these, barriers that we know do often exist?
Yeah, well, let me touch on both pieces of the executive order and just a very brief update on kind of where the state is in developing, planning for the plan, the master plan. I think there's been great progress since the end of 2023, where there was early planning with some of the state leaders in the space through, then there was 4 or 5 months of really intensive 7 or 8 stakeholder sessions in regions around the state, really trying to get input from various communities, with WestEd as the consulting partner, consolidating thousands of recommendations into a draft plan that will be public in July, and then followed by more opportunities for more stakeholder input, very focused advisory groups, to have the plan completed by the end of the year. I think what I can share is some of the emerging priorities will cluster around pulling out different demographics. I think traditional K-12 students, traditional age college students, opportunity youth, and adult workers, and each of their unique learning and employment journeys. As I mentioned earlier, the plan is likely to include the e-transcript, the career passport, goals and practices, and systems change around work-based learning and career navigation infused throughout those journeys, with increased collaboration and alignment among education and workforce partners. So I would say stay tuned. On the skills-based hiring, we at the Labor Agency have been working very closely with the Government Operations Agency, GovOps, and Cal HR in some of the work that they're starting to do. And I would say that there's early momentum in kind of looking at how the state can change its hiring practices. And so far, CalHR has identified 169 classifications that could be modified to skills-based hiring. A lot of these are at the staff service analyst level, which can be an entry point for advancement into all different kinds of roles. So that makes sense as a really good starting point. I know CalHR and GovOps are also looking at the exam, which can be a real barrier for people, and ways of making the exam itself more of a skills-based experience. And I'm really proud that, and I've mentioned Opportunity at Work a couple of times, that California is one of the founding members of the Opportunity at Work public sector hub, which, and I would say watch for an op-ed from James Regan, who's the Deputy for Workforce at GovOps, to appear nationally on why the executive order and why this is so important to California. So I would say there's some early momentum and a lot of work to do. And, we've talked about hiring practices across public sector. They're really slow. They're really arduous. We've heard things like, it takes a year for somebody to apply for a job with the state to get hired, and who can afford to be unemployed during that time? So I know CalHR and GovOps are doing some really great work going out to the state's career centers, working with nonprofit organizations, trying to do test, application workshops. But again, it's a supply and demand equation, and we want to get the supply side ready, and we need to work on, more changes to hiring practices to make them more timely and more accessible.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Abby, for addressing that. And certainly, as part of this research that we conducted with Lightcast, not only did we look into the data, we actually did engage with a number of focus group members from the public sectors in order to talk about these barriers. And certainly, the exam came up as one key point, for a lot of potential candidates. The notion of an exam to apply for a job is new and not something that is familiar to folks. So certainly, echoing.
And it causes anxiety. I'm sorry to cut you off, and probably unnecessary anxiety.
Yeah.
And even the term of the exam, because it's kind of an interview,
Right.
It can be an interview, but people hear exam and they clam up, especially adults who haven't been in a classroom for, many years. So I think there's some changes that could be made.
No, definitely. It is, that it just stood out so much when you were saying
Yeah,
it
yeah.
too. It's exciting to hear about the e-transcript career passports, because I think, in the conversations around connecting, and sharing the language, sharing a terminology that is accessible, not only from the employer side, but from the higher education or side. Having that and making it visible to build confidence and equipping that into the hands of the student, learner, employee is so critical too. So I think with that, I don't know, I'm watching my screen here to see, did anybody else have anything to add to that? Otherwise, we do have one more question and then a couple from the audience that we can add here. I think the last question, just kind of piggybacking off of the question for Abby, but this could be for anybody. But given our moment right now, like, what are some of the major reforms needed in the hiring process, so that we can make public sector more accessible and attractive to potential candidates? Like, what do we need to do in this moment?
I've got a whole list and would love for,
Yeah, let's do it.
you can tell how closely Adele and I work together, but apprenticeship is such a key tool. And especially with state service, and we're all working on this, figuring out ways that people can enter state service as apprentices. I mean, that's just not allowable now. It's really complicated, but we're hoping we can have some breakthroughs and figure out a way to do that. And even in the absence of registered apprenticeship, which of course is the gold standard, increasing opportunities for OJT at all levels and in all different kinds of public service. I think there could be some more work that we could do. This is more on the supply side than the demand side, on more mapping of the public sector. Even looking through the report, I think there are other, different kinds of agencies, and I think there's just more mapping we could do, especially for the workforce and education field, to get a better understanding of the public sector. The other thing that some of us have been investing in, excited about, and would like to see more is employment social enterprise, which is used, pretty widely, or it's used in the state, not as widely as it could be. So these are, primarily nonprofits, community-based organizations that are businesses themselves that provide jobs to workers. There are a few standouts. I'm thinking of Butte County Office of Education, Centers for Employment Opportunity, REDF, that work very closely with Caltrans as contractors providing jobs for highway maintenance. We could expand that model, throughout the public sector and state government, and remove some of the barriers which exist then for that time spent as an employee in a social enterprise to count towards minimum qualifications for a job. I think that's a practice that could really provide great pipelines for people who today aren't ready for to be successful in an exam process, but 6 months of employment and coaching and support could be. And then we've talked about some of the other things, accelerating hiring processes, doing that in partnership with both public sector and union representatives to balance the civil service protections, which are really important and hard won, with greater flexibility and speed. And we could do a lot more to deepen the partnerships among, this is so obvious, I almost hate to say it, the education system, the workforce system, other systems. The labor agency and EDD have just launched a new partnership with the Department of Rehabilitation to improve collaboration at the local level for adults and youth with disabilities, with a focus on public sector employment. And so we're hoping to pilot those in communities around the state, and just kind of get out of our own way and provide much more consolidated, streamlined, coordinated supports for people who have unique needs that we want to address and support into good jobs in the public sector. So those are a few things.
I obviously agree with all the things that Abby just outlined. I think you did an amazing job of essentially outlining the overall policy agenda in here. I just want to like come back to 2 or 3 small things in there. If we could just change it from being called an exam to like a skills assessment, oh my God, that branding change would be phenomenal. So like, I feel like there's some little, but I say they're little, but that would actually be massive to do from a policy and implementation perspective. But there are some like things like that I think could reduce psychological barriers to some of this public sector employment. And I would also say, Abby touched on the policy around how we invite new workers into state service, like how we could be doing public sector apprentice, like Cal HR, new entrant apprenticeships, I think is definitely an area that we're trying to explore. Teacher apprenticeships, we're also working on some like policy tweaks there to really align the Commission on Teacher Credentialing and the Division of Apprenticeship Standards as sort of like a joint entity. So those are a few key policy areas. But the other thing, and this is what I have learned in my time in the community college system, is the financial structures and the incentives for our education system are more centered on advancing people up the education system than they are in placing people in employment. Like the student-centered funding formula, for example, doesn't give a point for being in an apprenticeship, for example. Right. And so, but it does give points if you advance onto the CSU system, right? Which is great. I get it. But like, let's build in the career connected financial incentives into how our education system is funded. Because I think that, we've talked about a lot of different things here today that we can be doing. And certainly I see apprenticeship as a mechanism to better connect our education system to the needs of employers. Like when you design an apprenticeship, you're bringing together educators and employers to say, how do we train this person to come into this career? But sometimes we hit barriers with our educational partners because they're like, well, why should we come to this table? And it's like, what do you mean, why should you come to this table? Like, this is about preparing workers. And so I think being sure that we build employment outcomes into the financial structures for our educational system is also really important. And that sort of comes to the point that Abby was talking about of like aligning workforce and education system. Like it's all in there. So I don't know, those are just a few additional ideas I would put out there.
I would love to emphasize and co-sign to your last point in particular that there is a misalignment on the educational side of things that is a disservice to learners who need especially short-term training for that first, economic security foothold. Like we don't even open up the aperture of opportunity for advanced skilling and credentialing for a lot of folks just by structure and incentives. And it's so critically important to have our financing formulas reflect the new types of learners that need to matriculate through our system and at varying levels. Like those doors should continue to open and not be, single destination points, because it's not the way that people are really experiencing it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, those are all such important questions. And I think, so I'm looking at the time here, at this time just really flew by. We have about 4 minutes left. And, I think from the audience, there are 2 questions that's actually related to just the efficacy and evidence that we're seeing from skills-based hiring. One question related to like, do we have an example of the skills assessment, of a true skills assessment and affirmation of skills? Because I know we talked a little bit earlier about like, how do we build confidence within the system? And then, another question really important is, do we have evidence showing the labor market outcomes? Do we know that this works and is creating true equity? And I would love to hear from the panel, open to anybody who has anything that they would like to share on those 2 points.
Well, I could say I have not seen evidence. I have seen some research and writing, as I mentioned earlier, that this is early in adoption, that we don't really know yet. My go-to around skills-based hiring is Opportunity at Work. I think we can, look to them to see the evidence that they have. The whole concept of stars in the labor market, I think, has gotten some traction, skilled through alternative routes. And I'm guessing that they have some early evidence on some success.
Mhm. Yeah. I think one of the research that I've seen, at least the state of Maryland, one of the initial states that I believe it was through an executive order and through legislation that reduced the bachelor's degree requirement. Some of the early indicators did see that at minimum we're seeing the increase in pipeline up to about 40%
Nice.
additional increase into allowing those who would not traditionally have been qualified for these jobs to fill hard to fill jobs. So at minimum, I know that some of that evidence exists. And in the private sector, some early conversations, and we can definitely follow up on this too. We've seen skills-based hiring retention numbers actually was improved among individuals who were hired through a skills-based hiring approach in the private sector. But certainly, I think this speaks to the importance of the data, of tracking of the data that was mentioned, within Governor Newsom's executive order, and of course through just all of the work that we've been looking at here, is to ensure not only that we implement, but we're tracking very meticulously and looking at the successes. So with that, Arnie, I see that you've made it back. We apologize for technical difficulties, but I'm glad that you are back here. And we were just kind of closing out and our last question related to just some of the major reforms needed and any practical or evidence that we're seeing from skills-based hiring. But I don't know if you want to add anything. I know you were cut off kind of mid thought in your earlier conversation here.
I know we're wrapping up, and I apologize, everybody. My internet just went down on me for a few minutes or so.
Yeah.
But I'll just very quickly. The only point I was just going to make is that even though we find ourselves in a budget deficit, we're still spending an awful lot of money on a variety of different sort of programs. And I was just going to make the point that there are within where we are spending money. We are spending money on AmeriCorps programs. We're spending money on Cal Volunteers College Corps programs. We're spending money on a variety of other sorts of programs, I think, that sort of lend themselves to the connections and the pathways and the networks where there are individuals that might be in hard to employ populations, individuals that have sort of self-selected because they're interested in a particular field as an AmeriCorps volunteer or as a Cal Volunteers College Corps member. And I was just going to make the point that these individuals present opportunities for the public sector to connect with and to possibly get into the pipeline of public sector employment, given their interests as well as given many of the skills that they've gained doing their employment in some of these other types of programs. And so anyway, that was the point I was going to make. I appreciate folks allowing me to make that point. And it's been a very, very sort of rich discussion, and so much appreciated for my participation.
Yes. Thank you so much. And with that, I wanted to just take a moment to again thank our co-sponsors, NextGen Policy, Arnie, Ken, for being here. Of course, all of our panelists, Abby, Adele, and Ajita, for the such a rich conversation, and also wanted to take a moment to thank Lightcast for their support on the research, and appreciate everybody being here today. Again, thank you to all of our panelists, and with that, we'll go ahead and close.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ken and Ben, for the expert facilitation.
My pleasure.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.